So Ray and I decided that I was going to give you a quick overview of what happened there, what was the atmosphere at the summit, given that I was there. And I think it's interesting because it was much more colorful, we used that expression earlier on, than any other meeting that we normally go to, which is much stale, which is behind closed door, where member states make their own commitments and they talk really about the political agendas. The fact that there were over 9,000 participants in itself is already an idea of the success and the traction that the summit got. We have a lot of national NGOs, which again is something new for the system rather than large conglomerates or confederation of international ones. We have the philanthropic sector being present quite heavily, and there was a participation of over 1,000 corporations. And I believe that they speak to that idea of a collaborative, which a lot we see here in the 2 days, the 3 days we're just starting, where if we want to find sustainable, durable solution, we need to involve all the stakeholders, and we need to give the right space for everybody to have their say. The discussion around the summit were around 5 focus areas, 2 of which were more pertaining to international humanitarian laws, and in particular, the first one was towards ending conflict, so to put on the table the political will to make sure that those conflicts were coming to an end, or the length of such conflict was shorter. The second one was on IHL, International Humanitarian Law, protection of civilians, guaranteeing humanitarian principle during humanitarian crisis. And the 3 other roundtables were around resilience, ending needs, leaving no one behind, and finding suitable financial system for NGOs such as Oxfam, Action Against Hunger, and many others to be able to deliver humanitarian assistance. I will leave it here maybe for you, Ray, to integrate a little bit more about your take on it.
Great. Well, like Action Against Hunger, Oxfam is a large international humanitarian organization. We're one of the first responders to emergencies through the complex UN system. And so for us, along with Action Against Hunger, this was a very important event. And I think maybe it's maybe worth going a little bit deeper yet into this question of why a summit, why now, what's the critical issue that we're trying to deal with here. If you reflect upon this extraordinary moment we're living, we're seeing the largest refugee crisis since the Second World War. Something like 7 to 9 million Syrians have fled the country. There's a very large internally displaced population. There's mass migration to Europe from Africa as well as South Asia and Central Asia. And we've never seen anything like this. So many of our resources are going into trying to deal with that in terms of refugee resettlement, in terms of just protection issues, and dealing with the crisis in the conflict zones themselves. This is all happening around the Syria case, but there's also conflict in Yemen. There's conflict in South Sudan. There's a climate change, weather-related events that are affecting populations all over the world in a variety of different ways that are forcing migration as well. So in some sense, many of us in the humanitarian community are anticipating that this moment of migration is maybe the tip of the iceberg of what may become the new normal. And the question then is the humanitarian system fit for purpose for the 21st century, as Andrea has asked? And what exactly does that mean? Historically, we have all depended on a UN-led system, very centralized. The UN, it provides it is given permission by governments to intervene in these moments of crisis. There's a whole set of formalities that have been arranged over many decades to allow all of this to happen. Non-governmental organizations like ours fit into an orchestrated system. And then we come into a country with a rather heavy footprint, and ironically, we push aside all of the indigenous organizations, government agencies, and actors who are actually doing work when we arrive and have been doing it for 2 or 3 weeks before we get there. And so for many of us, there's this question of, if we're going to actually have a fit-for-purpose system for the 21st century, how do we actually de-stress the existing system, decentralize it, and in some ways come up with an entirely new system? So in the spirit of this conference, that's the innovations challenge. And it's innovation about organizational change, organizational structure, the UN having to let go of some of the control it historically has had over this system. And we need to build a whole new architecture. And a lot of the premise of this new architecture is about empowering governments and empowering civil society in many of the affected countries around the world. And how do you do that is kind of the innovations challenge, I think, that maybe we'd like to talk a little bit more about here today. So for Oxfam, we actually were part of a number of coalitions with other groups that were trying to push for this change. We produced a report about 2 years ago entitled Turning the Humanitarian System on Its Head, with an emphasis on this issue of local empowerment and local capacity building. And we took that agenda into the summit as one of the things we felt was very important in terms of getting an outcome. And we did that along with a lot of other organizations, not just ourselves. And then the other issue, which is very much of the moment, is the whole question of how governments around the world are respecting or not respecting international humanitarian law, human rights norms, so on and so forth. We're living in a very chaotic moment where we're seeing substantial human rights violations in a lot of these conflict zones. We're seeing disrespect for a lot of the norms that came into place after the Second World War that were about protecting citizens in conflict zones, protecting hospital facilities in conflict zones. All of these kinds of fundamental human rights and humanitarian norms that the international community was, in some sense, committing itself to respect in the aftermath of the Second World War, but now seem to be abused on a daily basis. I think we've had 7 hospitals that have been bombed in the last month and a half or 2 months. And we've never seen anything like this, in the last number of decades. So there's a serious crisis in respect for these norms. And because of that, it's also been very difficult to get the important negotiating partners together, the heads of state, to actually negotiate settlements, because they can't agree on what the core norms are that need to be put in practice to get a peace settlement. So the Syria war goes on 5 years, beyond 5 years, in some sense, because we can't agree on a normative framework for a negotiated settlement. And so many of the civil society organizations that were there because they were pressing the diplomatic representation to actually recommit to these global norms for humanitarianism and human rights. And you might want to say a word a little bit about what some of the core issues were that Action Against Hunger were actually championing at the event.
Yes, so the last point I wanted to make was that the other issue that we tried to tackle at the World Humanitarian Summit was the linkage between the Sustainable Development Goal and humanitarian action as such. 2015 was the year where the Millennium Development Goal were ending, and last year at the General Assembly, the Sustainable Development Goal were voted with very ambitious goal for 2030. While we were all excited almost a year ago when they were approved in September, now we started to be worried about how do we actually achieve such goal in a period where we are distracted, quote unquote, by all those recurrent emergency that does not allow organization to build sustainable solution, but we constantly put patches. Action Against Hunger, we were very actively engaged in the summit, and I thought we were very excited by the format, and we saw a lot of potential. And in particular, we'll start from where you left, the violation of international humanitarian law. We're very concerned, first of all, maybe in a selfish way for our own safety. Like many other organizations, we have periodic casualties. Our staff is armed, our staff is a target or is caught in the crossfire. So we were advocating vocally, and we have been doing it so for the last 2 years, on the stronger protection of aid workers, to make sure that every warring party to any war, being an asymmetrical war, a local war, or a war that includes established government, has a better understanding of international humanitarian law, the humanitarian principle, but also we are very much worried about the lack of protection of civilians, as you mentioned. So I was sitting in a panel discussion with ICRC, and again, we put out together some statements. The weakness of those statements is that as much vocal as we can be, the responsibility will lie on member states to make sure that there is protection actually for civilians, aid workers, and that IHL is properly respected. We also, our role was very much focused on building resilience in those countries. We believe that for way too long we've been working into responding to crisis, and our offices are open in those countries since more than 20 years. So we're there before disaster strike, if it is a natural disaster. We're there during a conflict or crisis, and we're there afterwards. We would like to be better into those continuum between preparedness, risk management, building resilience, and response. And I think that NGO has an active role to play in that. Oftentimes we complain about governments, we complain about lack of funding, but if we don't have solid strategy, if we don't make a commitment towards that, we perpetuate the system. So we were very strong in making our commitment to be better, design multi-annual strategy in those countries, work more with local partners. The last commitment we did, and I think is very much linked with the idea of innovation that also is part of this collaborative, is to use better cash transfer. I know that Oxfam is also very much involved in it. Over the last few years, the new trend is to use more and more cash transfer also and mainly in emergency. I think that the technology is there to help us doing it, to put people at the center, to have people making their own decision on what actually do they need in moment of distress. And with Oxfam, we're part of the CALP, the Cash Learning Partnership, whereby we build the experience of the sector on cash transfer annually. And I think that if we want to make a strong commitment to make the system better, we all need to work there. I think it was a good outcome because we commit to 25% of our initiative and humanitarian assistance to be done via cash, and many UN agencies made similar commitments, so this is positive.
Yeah, I mean, just building on that a second, I mean, I think maybe what would we want you to carry away from this conversation in terms of what happened at this summit? Because these things happen periodically, and maybe they don't get much press, and maybe you shouldn't necessarily pay that much attention to them. We basically feel, one, this was extraordinarily important that it take place right now because of what's happening in the world and what is likely to happen in the world over the coming decades in terms of increasing and intensified humanitarian crises and how the international community is going to handle that. It was particularly important also because of what Andreas said, in that in the past, these would be meetings of heads of state who might commit some money, a little bit more money than they did last year, but there really wouldn't be a challenge to their leadership in the way this meeting was. This meeting brought together representatives from civil society all over the world, governments, foundations, business, the private sector was there as well. And the real question was, how are we as civilized societies going to really manage conflict and manage the challenge of climate change and deal with the impacts it's going to have on people all over the world, and when it's going to happen on a scale that maybe we've never seen in human history. So that's the big challenge, and that's where I think we need the kind of innovations that we were just talking about. I mean, cash transfers, we've learned a lot about how to work in humanitarian emergencies and development work over the last number of years, and we're actually seeing that, you know, using cell phones and using modern technology, we can move money around much faster. We can help people quicker. We can get resources to first responders on the ground faster using innovative approaches. And so there's a lot of interesting work going on really from the ground up in many countries that actually have the capability of reforming the system if only they can get purchase on the leadership of the system to allow the change to happen. So in some sense, this is a political project in which we need citizens, we need organizations, we need business to be pushing for the innovation agenda to actually move forward. I think we're both optimistic that this was an important moment. There were some, I think, significant achievements in terms of commitments made. There was something like 1,500 to 2,000 commitments made by governments and organizations there that were not just monetary commitments. They were commitments to invest in capacity building, invest in technology solutions, and invest in leadership at the country level and new kinds of programs that are actually working with governments in new and innovative ways. I think if we had a disappointment, it was that the portion of the meeting that was devoted to this discussion about international humanitarian law, which would have required the presence of major heads of state from the United States, Russia, China, and many other governments, we did not get representation at that level. We got lower level representation. And some governments, the Russians and the Chinese, for example, were actually there, but were discouraging other governments from sending high-level delegations. In some sense, because they didn't want some of these tough issues about international humanitarian law and human rights to be even discussed. So we've got to continue to be pushing on those governments to be fully engaged if we're going to get this discussion on international humanitarian law moving forward. There were 60 heads of state there, and probably the only one from a major industrialized country was Angela Merkel from Germany. But she needed a lot more company, I think, to make that a meaningful moment.
Yeah, obviously so. I fully agree with you. I think that was the biggest disappointment. What was interesting, going back to maybe some of the takeout what we take out of this World Humanitarian Summit. The fact that we all could make commitments, and it was very interesting. I was able to speak between UNHCR, who made their own commitment, and the head of state of Angola. So it was completely mixed between government, UN agencies, civil society. I think some of us, and in particular local NGO, I will say, from the so-called Global South, they were able to shame governments because their commitments were much stronger than some coming from the member states. Some came with a very old school approach where they committed to something that they are already doing, and they know too well that those commitments are non-binding because they're coming outside of the normal place where they do them, which is the General Assembly. So accountability for member states is an issue. Whatever they might have committed there, strong or weak, is non-binding. Therefore, we need to set up such accountability mechanism. But I think that was interesting to see that dynamic, and I agree with you, the participation was weak from some states. It was interesting to see institutions such as the African Union being present, and I think they had an important role to represent the continent, not at the government level, whereby maybe some states have a very different agenda, but as a overstate entity which is playing a bigger role. The World Bank was there also, and I think that was interesting to see their commitment too. On a positive side, the financing was a good one, the commitment that happened on the financial level. Not the money put on the table necessarily, but the flexibility for players to decide how such funds were to be spent. In the past, organizations such as mine used to work on a grant, sometimes very narrow in terms of time, in the 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, therefore forcing us to do just first emergency operation in crises where we know that once they start, they might last for years. Now, with the new funding and the grand bargain discussion, we believe that over the last few months, we will have the opportunity to access to the same funding, ideally even more, but for a much longer period of time, with less bureaucracy and more discretion on us on how do we actually feel that they are better spent. If we are successful in engaging more with local communities, I think we can have more impact with the same. And I thought that was kind of revolutionary in itself.
Yeah, I mean, the money issue is really, really critical, and rethinking the money issue was, I think, something that, again, is going to require some creativity. Why is that? Well, there's $24.5 billion in the global humanitarian system now that's apportioned annually for meeting these different emergency needs. But only 1.8% of that is actually building local capacity in the way that's really necessary. So the change and the commitment that was made at the meeting is we need to get that up to like 25% of what we're spending. Because one of the things we've learned in doing this humanitarian work over decades is if you spend money in countries where you know that are subject to emergencies on a routine basis, like Philippines is in the circle of fire there in the Pacific, and Central America is frequently hit by hurricanes or earthquakes. Bangladesh in the Bay of Bengal is hit by typhoons rather frequently. We actually know what the map of countries are that are going to be affected by famines, by typhoons, by natural events of one sort or another. And then, of course, we know now the map of countries that are in conflict and have been in protracted conflict for some time. In many of those countries, particularly those affected by natural disasters, we know that if we invest money up front in protection and in prevention, for every dollar we spend, we save $8. In other words, we'd be spending $8 later to fix the problem that we actually could have averted if we'd actually spent money at the front end. And so we really need to be thinking about how do we spend that 25% wisely to deal with climate change issues in terms of adaptation and resilience capabilities, to actually be training governments to be better organized to deal with calamities in their countries, and also the civil society or non-governmental sector. In Central America, Oxfam works with a whole network of not-for-profit organizations, mayors, and ministries actually on a whole program to build capacity in that whole region collaboratively across those national boundaries. And now they're at a point where a not-for-profit that may be running a rural literacy program actually has the emergency capability to completely switch its mission in the case there's an emergency in that region. Or another group that may be working with rural farmers that has a kind of an agricultural livelihoods program will switch to being an emergency response program in support of the local mayor's office and in support of the provincial government. So when I'm talking about local capacity building, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about, what is the preparedness needs in a particular geography, and how do you think creatively about how you embed skill sets and protocols and relationships between key actors to make that all happen. It's a bit of a mind shift, and it also involves thinking about the fact that the big system that we have now almost assumes that the big agencies come in as saviors and everybody else steps aside. And in some sense, we're losing all of that local knowledge, all of that local capacity that's of the context that would actually can be put at the service of these emergencies that is actually already at work before we even get there. So that's a lot of what we're trying to harness through this, I think, this reform initiative that's being proposed at the summit.
I fully agree. It's a massive mind shift what we are undertaking at this stage. And if I look at my career, my first decade, I was actually going from one emergency to another, getting on plane, go there and deliver humanitarian assistance, and then off to the next one. I believe that there is some language into this agenda for humanity of the United Nations that speaks to our approach to be as local as possible, as international as necessary, where I think we really need to empower local civil society to do it to the level whereby we become almost irrelevant in many of the contexts. Southeast Asia is a perfect one for the emergency response. And we can focus actually where we're needed. I think that now we're spread way too thin because we try to be everywhere because we have failed to empower civil society in many places. Well, I wish that in the next decade, Action Against Hunger will focus our activity in Central African Republic, Yemen, Chad, South Sudan, places where there is not that local capacity, and we cannot be distracted anymore by other places where we can be a local capacity and be relevant. So.
Yeah, just on that funding question, again, I think one of the things we're having to think a little bit about is historically, much of the foreign aid that supported this work has come from the largest, say, 15 or 20 industrialized societies in the world through organizations that were created after the Second World War. Now we have new economies, emerging economies. There's lots of money. There's middle class. There's a new middle class in those societies. So there's a whole conversation going on around domestic resource mobilization in those countries that can actually support development in those countries, the kind of capacity building we're talking about, and long-term objectives of building infrastructure and so forth in new and different ways. So, and this involves helping these countries set up tax systems and build up that capacity for domestic resource mobilization effectively and efficiently at the national level. There's also countries that have not been major players and contributors to this humanitarian project over these many years. The Arab states, now they're coming in the Middle East as big funders of the relief that's going on around the Syria crisis, and there's other money from other governments that historically have not been involved. The Indias and the Chinas have not necessarily always been, or the Koreas have not necessarily always been major contributors, but they can be in the future, and they need to be brought in. And then we need innovation in the mechanisms that can be used actually to ensure resilience. For example, how might we use the insurance industry and the tools of the insurance business, if you will, to actually help regions recover? So, for example, the World Bank is now coming up with this new idea of a humanitarian bond, and they've pulled together a variety of Central America, of Caribbean countries that are often affected by hurricanes in the hurricane season, and they're kind of bundling the risk of those various countries into a pool, and then basically having a bond that will be paid out against a potential incident of a hurricane in one of their countries where there's significant money is needed for recovery. And this is a very creative new initiative on the part of the World Bank to kind of entice the insurance industry to think a little bit more creatively and long term about the kind of role they could play in financing that goes beyond the traditional, go to the 15 predictable donors and ask for money. So we're going to have to bring new money in from different sources and different places.
Yeah, I think that at the summit itself, what was interesting to see was also the new emerging donor, as you mentioned. First of all, it was organized in Istanbul, which by itself is revolutionary, not in the usual New York or Geneva or the center of power, of control of humanitarian aid. And it speaks volume to the commitment of the Turkish government to become a player, whatever political reason they might want to have. But also, if you look at the finances that a country like Turkey is putting on the table annually for humanitarian assistance, normally not channeled through the non-profit, but by subsidizing UN agencies and the like, is impressive. I think that is also changing the dynamics and the dialogue, because for us, we're used to talk with certain donors, but when new ones come on board, they might have new ideas, different ideas, and it shifts us to adapt the way that we want to see things happen. Civil society was big also in terms of funding. Philanthropic is stepping in big time into humanitarian assistance, just shifting away from only doing development, wanting to engage into that. And I think, as you stated, there are more funds available, but it's also an interesting time because those new players not only put money on the table, but they challenge us to work better, to do more, and to look towards solution rather than just do the day-to-day.
I think one of the two other areas maybe that were at the heart of some of these discussions, one had to do with rethinking the notion of partnership and how we relate to countries that are undergoing these kind of crises, and thinking a little bit more about partnership with governments and partnership with civil society as being a little bit more equitable and being sort of co-planners, co-strategists in the process, and giving voice to the populations in these countries as being, in some sense, a core premise to any approach that would assume local ownership and local leadership. And so that's again part of this whole area of having to have a bit of a mind shift if we're going to succeed in this transition from a highly centralized approach to one that's got more of a grassroots and national base to it. Then the other issue, which is much more, I suppose you might say, connected with the whole development field, is there's been historically a very, I suppose you might say, strict or I suppose you might say silos between those people who do humanitarian work, who rush in and do emergency work, and those people who are concerned about long-term development. And the problem with that is there's a bit of a disjuncture. If you're a humanitarian, you go in, you're there till we're able to lower the mortality rates and stabilize the situation, and then we leave. But we may leave a situation that requires a considerable amount of investment to get people back to a normal life. And what the argument that a lot of us are putting forward is we need to think of these moments as ones in which the development project and the humanitarian challenge are ones that are part of a continuum. That we've got to break down the silos, we've got to have greater flexibility in the way money can be used, we've got to think about moving communities from relief to rehabilitation to reconstruction in a continuum that has some logic to it in terms of funding and capabilities that are being invested in the process itself. And so a good deal of, that's another, I think, one of the areas in which we're trying to rethink the way the current UN system works, which tends to reinforce this separation of these two functions in ways that are counterproductive to the kind of outcomes I think we would all prefer to see.
Yeah, I think from Action Against Hunger, what was interesting for us to see is how those donors are changing also the lexicon, the way they talk about the problem, and more focus on the solution. For example, we've been talking about food aid, food assistance. All the money have always been earmarked towards a commodity, an input. We bring food into a country, which is, by the way, something we very rarely do at Action Against Hunger. Now, the money are related toward ending a problem, so it's zero hunger. The money is to eliminating hunger, eradicating hunger. And once the funds are made available, then you're working towards a solution rather towards then providing an input. Therefore, it will also force us to count not only on the outcomes by number of people we serve or number of food we distribute, hospital we work in, but in making that number smaller. Number of kids that die out of hunger or related causes, etc. And I think that the donors were very open to work with us toward that solution rather than just providing input and look good in terms of humanitarian. And again, this continuum between risk reduction, resilience, and emergency response was very, very present there. So I think there was a lot at the table in 2 days, and more than 135 side events took place in Istanbul, 15 special sessions, 2 days of plenary session where constantly there were member states reading aloud their commitments. Anything else from Oxfam's side that you think you would have liked to see happening there and did not?
Well, I think we're all hoping that in the upcoming UN session in New York, maybe just a few words on that. The Secretary General called us all together for this summit using a very unusual format, allowing much more participation and prior consultation, as Andrea said, than we've ever seen before. And But it was also a prelude to the General Assembly in September, at which, again, this issue of refugees and migration will be a centerpiece, and in which case the heads of state will be present, and there will be a lot of public pressure on them to be thinking a little bit more and giving consideration to these questions of international humanitarian law and human rights, and the behavior of governments around the world in these crisis situations where we're seeing, bombing, indiscriminate bombing by the Saudis of civilians and hospitals in Yemen, and we're seeing all kinds of other, mistreatment of civilians by the Syrian government in Syria. There needs to be a serious discussion about how are we going to, as a global community, deal with those issues, and the UN General Assembly is the place to have that conversation. The Obama administration is doubling down on these issues as well, and Obama, I think, is one of the last major things he will be doing before going out of office, is joining with the Secretary General and convening an event with heads of state around the General Assembly in New York, also focusing on refugee and migration questions, and I think also trying to, introduce some of this innovative thinking around funding to try to, in some sense, get more coherence in the way money comes in, depoliticize the way the money is being applied to within the system, and ensure this focus on international humanitarian law and rights. And then following that, the World Bank, headed by Jim Kim, who is himself a doctor and comes out of the Boston community here, Partners in Health, is, I think, also taken up this issue in ways the World Bank has never done before, and is going to be talking more and more about the use of insurance and innovative vehicles to respond to what he thinks are going to be a succession of these kinds of humanitarian crises in the future, something that the World Bank has never felt it's had to address as an entity before. So this is the year of humanitarianism. I think it's an important year for, all of us to stay focused on these issues. And I think the innovations question is one that, in some sense, was not at the front and center of this meeting, but I do want to put it before you as a challenge, because I think those of us who are, in the field doing this work, we're seeing a lot of interesting work coming up from the ground in countries like Kenya and Ethiopia, and even in the response to the Ebola crisis, where we had to learn, in some sense, how to deal with that kind of a pandemic on the ground, real time. And some of it had to do with organizational solutions, some of them had to do with technological solutions, some of them had to do with some medical responses to, to handling of patients in emergencies like that. So I think there's, within the larger organizational reform agenda, there's also a whole subset of problems where innovation, I think the invitation for innovation is there for all of us. And I think maybe in smaller subset sessions of this kind of an event or others, we can begin to kind of dissect a little bit what some of those other smaller challenges might be that people could take up, who are in organizations that have the appropriate skill sets and competencies to tackle them.
I fully agree. I think that innovation is becoming a buzzword, overutilized at times and very difficult to define. And at the summit here and there, it was used from different stakeholders in very different way. For some, it's just how do we use technology better in humanitarian assistance. For others, it's a different approach, cash transfer, for example, or longer funding, start working towards solution in an early stage. But if I focus about what has happened over the last 5 years, and Action Against Hunger, Oxfam, I've been pioneering some of these. Open data, for example, for us, we saw in the first open remarks, for example, Open Africa, how much data are used today, how much we used to create and generate data, collect information, but underutilize them. I think that today we're much better in the way we're using it in an innovative way. I saw the use of 3D printers in humanitarian assistance over the last 2 years, something I would have never thought of before. We use it ourselves in our logistic chain to be able to produce locally spare parts of hand pumps or some of our water purification filter. And I see mobile technology probably the biggest innovation that we have seen on a technical level. Now, the World Humanitarian Summit most likely is a place where people wanted to talk about it, but I'm not sure that the best players were around the table there. But of course there was a learning session, something similar to what I see around here, where we all were exposed to drones, how you can use drones for humanitarian assistance, and how we can be much better and innovative in the way we do. And I think that keep on talking about it, even in a place like World Humanitarian Summit, push People are always a little bit further, starting from our donor, into pushing them to invest into it and allow us to pilot something that sometimes could have, in 1 or 2 years, much greater impact in the way we work.
Yeah, and innovation doesn't necessarily mean large investments in expensive technologies. It may mean small investments in affordable technologies.
Right.
And I mean, just to give you one example that, that revolutionized, for example, the treatment of cholera. Some years ago, it was discovered that really you needed a salt solution, in a simple salt solution, fed to a cholera victim to stabilize sort of the illness. And that actually the whole creation of oral rehydration therapy took place. It was tested in certain countries where there was high incidence of cholera, but it was developed with innovation in centers here in the United States and in Europe. And it saved literally billions of lives, I think, over literally the last probably 30 or 40 years. So there's other probably solutions like that in the medical field. And in our case, for example, water filtration is, more people die of actually consuming non-potable water than actually of starvation. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people don't realize that. In Oxfam, actually, we shifted off being a real innovator in the field of food supply and nutrition to actually water, because we realized that actually the mortality issues were higher in that space. So if you begin to look at these issues of mortality, high mortality levels in these emergency situations, what are the causal factors, there's some space for innovation. I think the other big one is this whole question of resilience and adaptation to climate change, and what are we going to be doing in the agricultural sector for farmers who are actually affected by this. We're seeing, for example, in Central America, some of the refugee flow out of Central America to the border of the US, some of it's driven by conflict, some of it's driven by coffee rust that's actually been precipitated by climate change in that region. And we're going to be seeing, I think, more climate-induced migration where farmers can no longer make a living because of some sort of a malady with a crop that is really undermining the entire cropping system in their region. And that then becomes a humanitarian crisis that we had not even anticipated, because there's no major event and there is no conflict. There's just a slow degradation of a livelihood system that people have depended on for decades. So that's when I say I think we're seeing the tip of the iceberg of what humanitarian crises might be in terms of mass migration. That's really what I'm suggesting. So how do we deal with those issues? And that's going to involve science, organizational thinking, thinking in the financial markets, all sorts of areas where innovation will be, in one sort or another, will be a necessary contribution. So I think maybe we should just say, well, so what's next in terms of thinking about the fall and thinking about the larger project that we talked about, Andrea? What would you say in terms of sort of summary comments before we shift to Q&A?
Sure, that's the question that we are ask ourselves, and we've been asked since May 24th. When the door closed in Istanbul, everybody's like, okay, we got over 2,000 commitments. That's the last count. What do we do out of it? It's way too many. People committed in different array of issue. How are we going to group them together? I know that right now at the United Nations, they're trying to make sense of it all and identify 4 or 5 macro areas of commitments and see what are the one aspirational enough but achievable in the next 5 years. So that will be the first step, is to identify which are the key commitments that we can follow up on. You already have highlighted some of the next steps that are going to happen in the next couple of months. Key one will be, I believe, the General Assembly, whereby the Secretary General will sort of wrap up the World Humanitarian Summit and see this is what we think should happen in the years to come. One of the big question marks of the future is what will be the new Secretary General position about it. As you know, Ban Ki-moon is phasing out his role, so we will need to see the new leadership and how much they won't continue pursuing the same goal that Ban Ki-moon set into motion. The other thing which will be key for the success of the summit will be to set up accountability mechanisms. So far, we have all committed to a different array of items, but we're not accountable to anyone. Some organizations, such as Action Against Hunger and many other non-profit, are publishing their own commitments, and we're translating it into action, and we're publishing it with our local partners and the ministry of all the countries where we work, because we want ourselves to be accountable. But there is not an holistic system to do so. There is nobody who can point the finger at us or any member state for what they have committed to. So the risk is that there will stay empty words. And I think that what the civil society is already pushing the UN system to do is to define a clear accountability mechanism and to be able to roll it out by the end of the year. Other than that, I think the enthusiasm is still there. There will be very few negative comments of the outcome. Everybody were able to pull out some positive energy, at least, and motivation. And I don't know what Oxfam engagement will be in the months to come, but I believe that the next 6 months will tell us a lot.
Well, I think maybe just a couple of other comments. I think one of the precedents that were set by the meeting was it was a multi-stakeholder event that involved all sorts of people from all sorts of different parts of the world who have an interest in this issue. And there was a coalition called the NEAR Coalition, which actually is a coalition of southern non-governmental organizations who for the first time were able to attend an event like this and have real voice. I think one of our hopes is that we can sustain that presence and also that we can sustain the commitments to the 25% contribution for building local capacity going forward, which were part of a document that's called the Grand Bargain, which actually is the commitment that governments made to the idea of building local capacity for the future. So there was a very explicit commitment made to building local capacity that I think gives those of us who are in the, I suppose you could call it the activist community, an opportunity to kind of keep pushing that agenda is realized. And there was also another document called the Commitment for Change, which again is focused on local empowerment and local capacity building as well. So there's a number of things coming out of this meeting in which institutions, everything from the USAID, US government, to comparable aid agencies from other nations, to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, to organizations like ours, have committed to support these core principles. So we've got the platforms, and the Secretary General has given us these 5 large commitment areas. So I think we've got the general framework. Now I think we just have to keep pushing to see that there's deliverables against the commitments made and for both money and action for the future. And I don't think we should assume that we should be giving up that commitment after the meetings in September, October, but I think many of us are going to be trying to find other ways and other venues to continue the conversation. So maybe with that, we will maybe turn it over to you. I think we have maybe 10, 15 minutes or so, and we can take questions from the floor if anybody might have one.
Hi, really loud. Rebecca Miller with the Philanthropic Initiatives Center for Global Philanthropy. You talked a bit about philanthropy, about the Gates Foundation and how they were represented at this meeting, which I thought was really exciting and innovative. And I think philanthropy is changing quite quickly, but perhaps not fast enough to keep up with these conversations. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about how both the private sector and some of these foundations present, what kind of commitments they were making, how that ties particularly into the support for grassroots organizations and local capacity building.
Sure. I think there was a special session for philanthropists there at the summit and one for corporation. And what was interesting is that at the beginning I thought they were all splitting into their own side and talk only among themselves. But then it was an interesting mix. I was in one of them, and again to see the diversity of stakeholders in the room was really refreshing. What I think I really appreciate about philanthropy stepping in is that now they're willing to take a risk. And the word taking a risk was used several times by them. I presume I don't come from that field, but for us in emergency, our donors have always been governments, institutional donors, those who have a commitment to it. Well, for philanthropy, normally you're more risk averse. Part of it is a security risk, part of it is not being able to show a lot of success out of what you do. But to see some of those philanthropists stepping in and say, yes, we want to be part of it because we see that link between proper emergency response, humanitarian assistance and development, because we believe that in protracted crisis we can start working towards solution, was very refreshing and very important. So for me to see their commitment to sit at the table, to want to learn more about what are the issues at stake, what are the challenges around, was very refreshing, as I said.
I would just add that historically, most of the foundation community has taken the view that we're in the business of funding institution building and long-term development programming. So whenever there's a major calamity like a tsunami, the foundations oftentimes have to step back and go, should we contribute? And generally they're pulling money out of reserves to kind of make a contribution to the immediate response. I think what we're seeing in terms of change now is some reflection on the fact that crises, climate-induced crises, as well as conflict, is undermining the gains we might have achieved in development, and that we need to be giving some attention to this. And so the Gates Foundation, I think, is at the table in part because they're recognizing that many of the needs of the populations they want to serve are being undermined by these kind of events, and they want to just reflect upon what that means. And in the case of some others, and they're also very cognizant of the fact that there are the major events that we all see in the news. So we can talk about Syria and Yemen, and you'll all know what we're talking about. But are you aware that there's maybe a regional famine right now in Ethiopia, or another small famine event in another part of Africa, or that there's refugees in Tanzania crossing over because there's a conflict in Burundi? These are things that don't even get into the newspapers, and our organizations are actually dealing with them, as is the humanitarian system. And so the Gates Foundation, for example, has set up a whole program to deal with what they call forgotten emergencies. And at any given time, there may be as many as 25 of these. And they require response from the UN and response from organizations like ours, not major responses, but a response to deal with the immediate consequences of those events. So Gates is trying to actually open up that conversation about forgotten emergencies. Other organizations like Omidyar and Skoll over the years have actually funded efforts to kind of think about the systemic reform that might be needed, or whether technology, there's a place for technology and innovation in technology in delivery systems. This question about drones is an interesting thing. I mean, so for example, imagine that you have a situation where, you've got a medical emergency in a particular region, and you need to get medication there quickly, and there's no airport. What do? Well, now we can envision the potential of actually flying vital medicines to an emergency area across maybe even battle lines in a war zone via drones. And there's research going on this. There's innovation in terms of the drone technology, and it's actually probably going to happen if it isn't already. And many of our organizations are going to have to think about, well, do we have to hire a drone specialist? So I think some of the foundations are thinking along those lines about systems reform, technology, trying to borrow from some of what we've learned about mobile money in Kenya, and can that be applied to these emergency situations. One of the big actors in the private sector, amusingly, in this area is Visa and MasterCard. So in many cases, we've been working in these emergencies where rather than give people cash, you give them a credit card that Visa and MasterCard might supply to us, and there's a certain amount of money that's provided on a monthly basis on those cards, and people can spend money off those cards. Now that has a number of different benefits, because once people have money, it starts to stimulate the return of the economy in that region, and rather quickly, and then stores start to reopen and the economy starts to revitalize, farmers start producing again, or they can buy seed with the money they're getting through the cash assistance program. So we can actually accelerate through using a credit card mechanism the whole redevelopment process and getting people beyond the emergency relief stage. So these kinds of things I think the foundations are quite interested in as new approaches, where they think their limited money, rather than the very large amount of money you need to sustain a refugee camp, can actually play a strategic difference.
Hi, my name is Adrienne. I work with an organization called Water for Good, and we actually work in the Central African Republic. We've been there for 12 years. And my question is, how can the takeaways from this summit inform the support of fragile governments and weak states? And just a proposal that we've seen in the Central African Republic is the role that both NGOs and local civil society actors can play in helping to provide sustainable services in the water sector and other sectors to communities directly, somewhat coordinated by government, but specifically figuring out how to invest in infrastructure in a way that's going to be sustainable long-term, even when the funding might be in response to an emergency. I think there's plenty that could be said about the sort of poor humanitarian response in the Central African Republic to the conflict there. There's been many scandals and other issues, and so what takeaways from this summit could inform a response to a conflict like the one in the Central African Republic or in other fragile states?
My first reaction is not that positive, because I think that Central African Republic have not been discussed almost at all at WHS. I think that one of the issue was that the Syrian crisis was overly present, obviously so, being hosted in Turkey, which is dealing with a lot of the refugee crisis, which is undertaking deal with the European Union, etc. And there was also a lot of civil society from the Middle East presented. So one of the threats before the summit, which actually happened, is that the Syrian crisis was at the core of the summit. Therefore, other forgotten crises, as you referred to, were not being addressed at all. And I think that this is one of the issues that we need to tackle in the future. And this is where we need to continue pressuring on the member state to be stronger into having a voice into that. Again, the problem when it comes to Central African Republic is how do we make sure that the political will is there? Those which actually put an end to the conflict ongoing will take proper action to that. The crisis is completely underfunded. The CAP, the Consolidated Appeal, is funded at 10–15% of the global needs annually. The role of the UN peacekeeping mission is very questionable, and they're gone through recurrent scandals. So I think that it will require a summit in itself, and I don't know when and how they will prioritize such a country as Central African Republic. So,
but beyond the Central African Republic, I think you're posing a larger question for all of us, which is something that's very much in the mind of a lot of us in the field, which is how do we manage these kinds of responses and the practice of humanitarianism and even some of these new ideas in fragile states? And how do we try to, as an international community, prevent the fact that we don't want a proliferation of more fragile states? I think that's actually what conflict produces. I mean, so Syria today is now a fragile state. It wasn't actually 6 or 7 years ago, but now that it's not only is it a fragile state, but it's creating fragility all around it. So the proliferation of fragile states is a threat to security in entire regions of the world. So one of the things I think is being discussed within the foreign affairs community and also the development community is what's our role? How do we intervene? What kind of investments do we make? How are they different than what we can do in more established democratic or quasi-democratic governments where we can actually work with solid institutions where there's probably going to be some corruption and maybe some malfeasance, but it's manageable and there's a certain level of transparency. The fragile state problem just produces, it means that we have to use more traditional means. We have to really struggle to find good partners in civil society. We have to hope that there's space for us to work and that our staff is going to be secure and the partners we're going to be working with are going to be secure. Working in Somalia today is a very tricky business, whether you're in Mogadishu or other parts of the country, because your staff or the staff of the people you're working with can always be in jeopardy. So I think there's no simple answer to I think what you're asking, which is a very challenging question. But I think it's one that we've got to keep before us as humanitarians and as even as global citizens concerned about security here at home as well as in other parts of the world. Because it's in those fragile states that a lot of the kinds of problems we're facing globally are being bred and then exported.
And Ray, I would add that in all those fragile states, the problem for a humanitarian agency is also how do we uphold to the humanitarian principle? How can you build something sustainable in partnership with local entity when you need to keep impartial, neutral, independent, and you don't want to be caught taking anybody's sides of the conflict. So it's an additional complexity in that too.
And I think maybe one of the things to recognize today for those of us in the humanitarian community that do this work day in and day out is traditionally, in the years of the emergence of the Red Cross, there was a recognition that if you had a white flag and you were a humanitarian organization, the combatants recognized that you were neutral or impartial, and you had, under international law, you had access to affected populations to provide medical supplies, water, food, whatever was needed. Today, basically, journalists and humanitarian workers are seen as soft targets and opportunities for a CNN moment. So we've had to kind of, in some sense, recognize the realities of the context in which we work today are much more life-threatening to our people than they have ever been. And that's why this recognition of the commitment to international humanitarian law and human rights and respect for access to affected populations, which is so critical to the work we do. If they're not respected, it's, you know, all bets are off. In other words, you can't, you know, you're going to have whole populations like we see in Syria today, this population in Daria that just got food after 5 years. Why is that? Because the whole right of access that's central to international humanitarian law was not being respected by the Syrian regime. They were starving out their own population. I mean, some of these things we're seeing are, you know, unprecedented in the scale in which we're seeing them. So that's why there's an urgency to this conversation globally and within our own countries. And maybe with that, shall we take one more? 2 minutes? We'll take that question back there.
Thank you. Hi, my name's Casey Hogle. I'm with Search for Common Ground, a peace-building organization. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I very much appreciated your comments about the importance of unsiloing development and humanitarian actors and some of the conversations that occurred at the summit around that. I'm curious if there were any discussions about integrating as well the peace-building community. And I'm not talking just about conflict sensitivity and provision of assistance, but really about the importance of the peace-building community in pre, post, or ongoing conflict contexts, and if there are conversations happening at the summit about all three fields and the importance of unsiloing each one and conversations between the three.
Not too much. The very short answer I can give you is not too much. There were definitely on the one on ending conflict and preventing conflict, there was something, but I'm afraid that part was still a bit siloed. I think that the peace building is still considered as something else. Well, meanwhile, we can take down the barrier between emergency and development. Peace building is considered as something that for member state and for a very particular niche, not a component of humanitarian assistance. So not too positive on that regard, at least in the summit. I don't know what will be the follow-up, but nothing exciting, I'm afraid.
So with that, we want to thank you all for joining us this morning. I hope you found it stimulating and hope you enjoy the rest of the day here at the Classy Awards. Thank you all very much for joining us.
Thank you.